And this session will have two parts to it. First of all, Professor Porter is going to give us a general reflection based on what we've heard about, what we heard in the panels and different presentations. And after that, I'm going to ask him some questions that you have presented us with. There were many questions, so I'd like to thank you all. It was more than 50 questions, and we had the opportunity to go over them quickly. We selected a few of them, and I'm going to ask Professor Porter these questions in the second part of this session. So, Professor Porter.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the panel for all those comments, which I thought were very helpful and really started to bring the whole concept of clusters to life, show what was actually happening, and kind of highlight some of the opportunities. Also, I just want to take this opportunity to recognize Professor Ramirez, who is one of my closest colleagues, and we've had a chance to work together all over the world, as well as in Latin America, as well as in Colombia. And, you know, if I were going into any place in the world to do clusters and economic development and shared value, I can tell you who I'd want by my side, and that's Professor Ramirez. So I just want to recognize his enormous contribution to this work. So I thought I would make a few opening comments after listening to the discussion and kind of reflecting on my knowledge of what's going on here in Colombia, and then turn quickly to the questions. We got so many questions that it was very intimidating. How were we going to answer all these questions? So Professor Ramirez, with my help, as we've sorted through these and we've identified a number of areas which we thought would have the broadest appeal and broadest interest to the most of you. But let me start with some opening comments, and I'll focus on clusters because we have a session a little bit later on about shared value. You'll hear more about shared value. You'll see some examples of shared value, and so let's focus mostly on clusters for this session. So I think the first thing I want to say is clusters are really not just about export, but they're really about all of the economy. And we find that clusters are very common also in local businesses. And we find that clusters are not just really a way of stimulating exports outside the country, but they're a way of stimulating more trade within the country. If each region kind of builds strength in particular areas, then we have a lot of internal trade, which is also encourages productivity. And one of the great advantages we have historically had in the United States is we have a lot of internal trade. Our internal trade is very open, and that allows each region to specialize in those areas where it can be highly productive and where it can build a cluster. We have the advantage in the U.S. of maybe much easier logistics and much better developed logistic infrastructure. It's very easy to trade across states in America. You know, we have good roads and railroads and airports and all that. In Colombia, this is one of the challenges facing the country of how to really connect the regions to make the internal trade and flow of ideas and resources more and more efficient. And so that is really a national strategy issue that work is being done on, but I think that work needs to continue. Now, as we look at cluster development, not only internationally, but within Colombia, we see a lot of different approaches taken. And there's no one way to do it, but I do believe that if you don't do it right, what will happen is that you'll have some meetings, you'll have some discussion, but you won't end up with something that lasts and is sustainable over time. So let's just talk a little bit about what is a good cluster initiative? What does it look like? And I think that, number one, it starts with really defining what the cluster is and drawing some boundaries. I think, in Colombia, for example, we use the word sector a lot. So we're talking about the manufacturing sector. Well, a sector is not the same as a cluster. A cluster are very connected products and companies. And so maybe there's an automotive cluster, not a manufacturing cluster. So part of the challenge is to get the boundaries aligned with productivity and competitiveness. If you get too broad a definition of the cluster, then you have all these people come and they don't have anything to talk about. Their problems are too different, their needs are too different. And I've seen this over and over again. If you have the cluster too narrow, this is the cluster of purple shirts, then again, what happens is many of the key drivers of competitiveness are really outside the cluster. So it's defining the cluster, getting the boundaries to relate to productivity and linkages. That's kind of step number one. Step number two is mapping the cluster. What are the various entities and stakeholders that are part of the cluster? What's government doing? What's universities doing? What are vocational institutions doing? How about supply? What are the key suppliers? What are the key service providers to that cluster? Mapping the actors in the cluster, both business and non-business. And then making sure that all those actors are invited to participate. One of the big mistakes in cluster initiatives is, entrepreneurs get together, but the other actors are not there. And the entrepreneurs can talk all they want, and they can have all these issues, but if the other actors don't hear, and they don't participate, they don't understand really quite what they need to do. And so the cluster effort is really about cross-stakeholder collaboration, not just collaboration within the business community, and not just within the end product producers, but also in the suppliers, as well as the end product producers. So there's mapping the entity and convening the entities. And one of the powerful roles that the Chamber is playing here in Bogotá is actually helping to convene, helping to get the players together, and being the host of that process. And that's a very, very powerful role. So we define, we map, we convene, and then there has to be assessment of the business environment and the kind of obstacles and assets, of the cluster. And that's going to vary dramatically from region to region, cluster to cluster. But the key is to have data, to have facts. I've seen a lot of cluster initiatives where people just sit around and talk, and everybody has their ideas, but nobody collects any data. There's no benchmarking. There's no comparison. There's no assessment of, how we're doing versus peers. Part of any good cluster initiative is identifying the other clusters in other countries or other regions that are really the most competitive with this cluster, and really being honest and open and fact-based about making those comparisons. So that's kind of the assessment phase. And then coming out of that, hopefully, will be a small number, maybe anywhere from 3 to 5 or 6 initiatives that are efforts to address weaknesses or build on strengths. We heard in the software cluster, critical shortage of trained human resources, okay? That then is probably the place where there needs to be an initiative. And that initiative has got to get the training providers, the educational providers together with the cluster members to define what the gap is. what the needs are, what skills are required. And we're seeing many, many cluster initiatives be tremendously powerful in human resource development because the cluster process understands the needs of the human resource, what skills they need. And that's critical to guiding the educational institutions in creating the right programs and the right courses and the right curriculum. So skill development is almost every cluster needs to have a skill development initiative. It's always an issue. It's always a problem. Another area is supplier development. Where do we lack critical suppliers of services, of components, of technology of various kinds, things that we have to import now? How can we build a stronger local supply chain, a local supplier base? Because that's much more efficient than having to import things. How can we get the foreign suppliers that are now shipping, how can we get them to establish an operation in Colombia to be part of the cluster here, not just send stuff from somewhere else? So supplier development is another critical initiative. Almost every cluster will have supplier development, although, again, it depends on the circumstances and the priorities. In some clusters, there needs to be environmental programs. If one of the big issues is environmental impacts, raw materials, energy issues, carbon issues, and so forth, again, an initiative can be created putting the company's minds and resources together to figure out how to improve technology to mitigate those environmental problems, rather than each company having to do this by themselves. Getting the benefits of collaboration, the benefits of pooling your talent and your resources to do environmental remediation or improve environmental technologies. That's another common area. There's also the critical interface between the cluster and government. What government services and what government regulations have the biggest impact on this cluster, with a focus on the biggest negative impact. And then how can we create a specific agenda that tries to address those obstacles, which are not in the interest of the companies, they're not in the interest of the region, they're not in the interest of the country in terms of growing this business and growing jobs in this business. What we find with cluster initiatives is that if you go to government and you're just one company and you have a request, government will listen, but, there's many requests. But if 200 companies that are part of a cluster initiative show up and talk to government about a need that will benefit all of these companies, that's the kind of thing that government is increasingly excited to do, willing to do, and feels a sense of urgency to do. So part of your job as a cluster is to build an identity as a cluster, not just as one company. We had this in Massachusetts. Years ago, I was leading kind of the economic development private sector efforts in the state, and we discovered that we had like 300 medical device companies that made various kinds of medical instruments and medical equipment, but nobody knew it in the state. Even the companies weren't quite aware of how many other companies there were, and they never met. And once we got those companies together, first of all, they started to see all the ways in which they had the same issues and they could deal with them together. But we also created a tremendous identity for this cluster in the state as one of the major growth areas of the state's economy. And all of a sudden, all the political leaders understood why this was something they should spend time on. And we got some remarkable things done in terms of public policy as a result. So cluster initiatives are partly things you can do by yourself, for yourself, but it's partly creating an identity and a visibility which allows the other stakeholders to understand why it's important to do your request rather than all the hundreds and hundreds of other requests that they get every day. So that's some of the process of cluster development that we find works. It's got to be it's not just meetings of the entrepreneurs. It's not just talking about how bad everything is and how miserable the government is and, you know, complaining. Cluster development isn't complaining. It's about acting in a variety of ways. And cluster development works the best if you can somehow institutionalize it, particularly in the private sector. If you can create a cluster organization, and I think the Bogotá Chamber of Commerce is doing a marvelous job in serving as part of the institutionalization of these clusters by making this an official activity of the chamber, by creating staff and support for the cluster development process. But ultimately, we need to bring that process really into the private sector itself and sustain it over time. So hopefully that gives you a feeling for how you would get started, what some of the steps you might ultimately choose to take are, and hopefully those will be helpful to you. Now, in terms of shared value, I want to just make it clear that, remember when I was talking about shared value, there are 3 levels of shared value: product and the customers you serve, the value chain, how you operate, and the surrounding community or surrounding environment. And I just want to make it clear that participating in cluster development is part of the 3rd form of shared value. So that really everybody here ought to be participating in cluster development. That's an opportunity you all have actually to add shared value in your community, and we'll see examples of that later on. Now, let me just make kind of one more point here, and then we'll answer questions. Colombia as a country is, as I said earlier, progressing. The economy is growing. It's not growing quite as fast as we would like. There are still obstacles to competitiveness at all levels. But I think I want to focus on just briefly here is the fact that this is still a country, where we have a lot of inequality. This is a country where the Gini coefficient is still high. And this is a country where actually that hasn't changed that much. Yes, there's some improvements in poverty rates, but if you look at that measure of inequality, this is still a country where that is a substantial national agenda. I know you all know that. And if the president was here, he knows that. I think what this is telling us is, despite maybe at least 10 years of serious focus on competitiveness in Colombia, we haven't moved that metric. Still a lot of inequality. Things are better, but there's still a lot of inequality. And I think what that tells us is that the current approach, which has been heavily based on a lot of public policy, is not ultimately enough. If we're going to get at this very challenging issue of inequality, I think, again, to me, what I'm learning from my work around the world is we've got to get you, the private sector, involved. And shared value and cluster development are 2 of the most powerful tools for reducing inequality. Cluster development, if it's done right, aggregates a lot of small companies, not just the big companies. It provides a vehicle for spinning off new suppliers, for improving skills, for proliferating services. It starts to bring all these little tiny companies more into the mainstream and helps them grow and helps them kind of raise their productivity and therefore the wages they can pay. And then shared value is about having the companies start to deal with the underlying kind of causes of inequality: poor health, lack of housing, inadequate economic opportunity. And so I think the great economic challenge of today around the world is not so much just competitiveness. That's always a challenge. But I think today we're recognizing that the fundamental challenge today, that's sort of the new challenge that we now are aware of, is this challenge of inequality. And we have it in the United States. It's a serious problem. It's a problem that even in the United States is causing Americans to fight and be against Americans. You know, we're having a war among ourselves, among the people who have not and the people who have. And we're having a tremendously divisive conversation about that in our country. And I think that, you know, our lack of progress politically and in government over the last 5 years or so is a function of the fact that we are fracturing a little bit as a society between the haves and the have-nots and the political parties that support one group versus the other. And that's meant that our improvement as a nation in terms of our competitiveness has stopped in America. We haven't gotten one important thing done in the last 5 years, not one. We haven't reformed our corporate taxes, we haven't improved our infrastructure, we haven't made trade agreements, we haven't done anything because we've been fighting among ourselves and we've been fighting about who deserves to have what and who's getting too much money and who deserves more and who should get this benefit or that social benefit. Or that doesn't sound like America, does it? But look at how important this issue is. And in Colombia, you know, we have to find a way to bridge this gap between those who are doing okay and prospering and those who really have not, for a whole variety of historical reasons. Government and NGOs have a lot to do to solving those issues, but I think we in the private sector can't wait any longer to get involved. I think a lot of our what we can do in our cluster development efforts and our shared value efforts is going to deal with some of the root causes of inequality. You know, I'm just thinking of one example from Peru where I have worked and Jorge has actually worked with me. And you know, there's a group in Peru called the Interbank Group or Intercorp, and among the things they do is they build shopping centers. And you know, where did they build most of their shopping centers? Well, if we all took a vote, we'd all be right. Lima. That's where all the shopping centers are. Because that's where the middle class is, that's where the big mass of people with money is. And that's the conventional economic model of a shopping center company, was to focus on Lima and build more shopping centers for the rich people. Well, this company figured out that yes, it would do that, and it has a lot of those urban shopping centers in Lima, and it will continue to do that in other cities, you know, in Peru. But what they started to realize was that actually isn't the biggest opportunity they have. The bigger opportunity they have is all these little small towns all over the highlands of Peru. And you know, and so they started looking at these areas too, and a lot of people live, you know, outside of Lima. And nobody'd ever thought that they could possibly be a market for a shopping center, much less anything else. But what this company found was when they went into one of these small towns up in the mountains and built an actual nice, world-class shopping center, not only did the citizens of that community, you know, shop in that shopping center, it changed the whole community. It made people, it just changed the whole attitude that everybody had in that community. Oh, we're a real town. We have a real shopping center. We have really good places to buy modern goods at low cost. You know, we don't have to get on the bus and go to, you know, Lima to buy things, you know. And it motivated and inspired the community. Other things started happening. So government couldn't do that. It was a private company building a shopping center that had the biggest impact on so many of these communities that has ever happened in all of history. And that's the potential we have in the private sector. If we could just think about how what we do really matters to people in their lives and their sense of opportunity and their sense that they're part of the mainstream and that they're connected to the rest of the people in the community. I mean, we have enormous power to sort of shift the direction here. But, you know, we in the private sector, we're going to have to reconceive of our role and see all those opportunities out there that we have to make a tremendous difference. And by the way, this shopping center was not a charity. This is a business. It turned out to be a really good business. It turned out that people in these towns, they have money. They just didn't have any place to spend it. And if they spent it, they were having to pay too much and not get good quality. So this is a business. It's profitable. And it can be spread. There could be shopping centers like they're building everywhere in Latin America. And this could be a multi-billion dollar business. Just by seeing the world a little bit differently and defining the purpose of the enterprise, not just in kind of meeting the traditional needs of the traditional customer, but thinking in terms of shared value. You know, how can I create a business that actually has a profound and positive and beneficial effect on human beings, you know, in communities in which I operate. Some of them are going to be my own workers and their families. So I just want to leave us with the fact that this stuff about shared value and cluster development is, you know, I think smart economic development, thank you, but it goes beyond that. It's really about how to build societies and how to bring people together and how to create economic opportunity and how to create the perception of social opportunity. And I think that is the number one challenge in the world right now in this phase of our societal and economic development, as we have this complex global economy with all these skills necessary and all this technology. We've got to solve this problem, and Colombia needs to solve this problem. So, Jorge, let's see if we can answer some of those questions.
Okay. Well, thank you, Professor Porter. So let's begin with the first question. The first question is, what should be the role of the government on developing clusters? And there is a related question. The related question is, what has been the role of subsidies in developing these clusters?
Yeah. Well, I think the traditional view of economic development is so-called industrial policy. And industrial policy is really about government promotion of industries. You know, ironically, the theoretical foundation of industrial policy was created by my friend Paul Krugman, which would not be something I want on my resume. I invented industrial policy. But you know, Paul is very liberal and believes very heavily in the role of government as driving things. And industrial policy was the idea that you should provide support for industries that could then grow and achieve scale in your country, and then that would lead to exports. And one of the most common tools for doing that was subsidies. Subsidized capital, low-cost capital, subsidized real estate, rebates of taxes. And what we learned is that almost never works. I mean, I wouldn't say never because I can't prove it, but I mean, I did a book on Japan some years ago, and the general view of Japan was they were successful because of industrial policy. In fact, Japan was the argument in favor of industrial policy. And the idea was the Japanese government, MITI, remember MITI, you know, went in and provided support and subsidies for all these industries, and look at how wonderful Japan was. We actually did a book on this, and after 3 or 4 years of work, what we discovered was that all the industries in which MITI was using industrial policy, none of those were successful. None of them. And the industries in which Japan had become world class were industries in which media wasn't there. Like automobiles. Automobile industry said, media, no, we don't want your help. The chemical industry said, oh yeah, come on in, protect us, give us cheap capital. Chemical industry in Japan is a disaster. So industrial policy, this traditional view that the subsidy is, see, the idea was that there's another argument in economic development called infant industries, where you have small industries that are just getting started. You want to nurture those industries so that they can grow up to be children and adults, you know. And you nurture them by, again, cheap capital and maybe a little protection against imports and a few things like that. And then the child can grow into a teenager and the teenager can grow into an adult. Again, the arguments, the data show that that almost never works. If you protect a business and subsidize it, it never learns how to compete. It never gets competitive. It just goes back asking for more protection and more subsidy. It's a vicious circle. And I think this is the history of Colombia. I mean, if you go back, a lot of that happened in Colombia. A lot of trade barriers, a lot of protection, a lot of special favors, and that didn't get us anywhere. I think, 10, 15, 20 years ago, Colombia got on a different path, much more of an open path, and I think the progress you've made is a direct relationship to that. So I think the cluster development is not about distorting competition. It's not about subsidy. It's not about protecting. It's not about intervening in competition. Cluster development is about raising the standard of competition, improving the skills, improving the technology, improving the infrastructure so that people can be efficient, and then celebrating competition, taking the competition to a higher level so that the textile industry in Colombia is not competing on who can get the most subsidy, but the companies are competing on who can create the best style or the best design. Taking competition to a higher plane. That's what cluster development is all about. So I think in general, I hope that there's now consensus in this country that that's the way to go. And that's why this effort at the Chamber is so important, because I think if a lot of you can get involved in this and start to participate in this, I think we can maybe once and for all put behind us this idea that this old path that we used to take is a path that bears any interest at all.
Here is a question similar to one that Mauricio Reina asked during the panel session. And the question is, what's the difference between an industry association, which is a gremio in Spanish, and a cluster initiative?
Well, a cluster initiative is sort of a process in which a group of actors is collaborating in a variety of ways to raise the standard of competition in a particular field. Improving skills, improving infrastructure, simplifying government regulations, whatever's necessary in that cluster. A cluster initiative is about an organized, collaborative effort to address those issues. An industry association is an organization, and because it says industry association, it's organized around an industry. And the traditional industry association was the vehicle by which industries got subsidy and protection. That's what industry associations did. They were really about rent-seeking behavior, about trying to get special things for their industry. That's what the traditional industry association did. Now, is that what industry associations have to do? No. In fact, what's happening around the world is industry associations, the traditional industry associations, have morphed and redefined themselves really into cluster associations. And really, it's just an organization that's focused on the long-term process of upgrading the cluster. So we have an industry association in Massachusetts. It's called MassMedic, and that was created about 2 years into the development of the medical device cluster in the state. And the medical device leaders understood that they needed an organization that would have a staff that could actually do the work and the coordination required to improve skills training, to deal with Washington on regulation, to do all the other things that need to be done. So in that case, there was no industry association before. They created one, and it was created around cluster development. The challenge is not to eliminate industry associations, but first of all, make sure that they're not about a narrow industry, but they're about a whole cluster. But make it from an industry association to a cluster group. And then to transform the agenda of the industry association away from the traditional kind of subsidy and dealing with government, and towards actually the steps involved in building a cluster. A cluster initiative is more of a process going on. The organization, the association, is the institutional structure within which the cluster initiative can continue on. So these are names of institutions that have had historical meaning, but I think we have to redefine their meaning. Again, a chamber of commerce, the traditional chamber of commerce didn't do clusters. The traditional chamber of commerce was a lobbying group for the interest of business, in government. But now I think we're starting to understand that chambers of commerce can do so much more to actually add value to business. Not just try to extract value from the government, but to actually create value through supporting collaboration. And again, that's the wonderful, exciting thing about what's happening here in this chamber in Bogotá.
Some people here in the audience want to hear about experiences, successful experiences on cluster development. So could you mention one or two regional experiences in the world where cluster development has made a difference?
Yeah. Well, I think one I would mention that all of you can read about if you're interested is actually the Basques. You all know in Spain they have these kind of very semi-autonomous regions, and the Basques are in a way the most semi-autonomous of all the semi-autonomous. I mean, the Basques would they'd like to be a country. They don't want to be part of Spain. That's not going to happen, anytime soon. So I think they're working much more collaboratively now. The Basque country was one of the early industrialized economies in Europe. Very wealthy, going way back to the 1800s. And they had iron ore, they had the major steel mills, shipbuilding. They were a major industrialized economy. They were very wealthy. Traders, global traders, a tremendous history of the Basque country. But in the 70s and 80s, the Basque country just went through a devastating downturn, as these traditional industries just started dying one after another because they were too high cost, they weren't efficient, they weren't productive, the market was globalizing. And the Basques really, the vice president of the Basque country at the time, showed up in my office one day and said, we've heard about, I saw a presentation about this concept of clusters. And we want to try that in the Basque country. So to make a long story short, really from the beginning of the post-Franco era and when the Basque country regained autonomy again, cluster development was really a core part of its agenda. And the results of that have been just breathtaking. I mean, I think it's the most prosperous region in Spain. It's one of the most prosperous regions in Europe. Has tremendous technology and skill and exports and trade. it's been a really great success story. It wasn't easy. The cluster concept has been passed from one government to the next government. I mean, everybody continues that policy. So it's not political. I think we have a case study on the Basque Country, so any of you that are interested, reach out to Jorge or me, and we'll send you that case. It's a case that shows just how powerful this is in creating competitive advantages and a highly productive business environment in the various fields in which the region competes. There are many other success cases, but that's one that just comes to mind, and I think you all would be excited by that one just because they started from a position of being quite depressed. And by sticking to this, we're able to really change the entire economy completely.
Another question has to do with the role of academia in cluster initiatives.
Well, I think that academia is a little bit of a broad phrase. I mean, we need a good basic education system, what we call in America, you know, pre-kindergarten through 12th grade, high school. That is a critical foundational asset for every country. If you don't have people graduating from high school that have ability and skill and they're numerate and they're literate and they're intelligent and well educated, then it's very hard, you know, to overcome that. But pre-K through 12 education typically is not a cluster issue, and that is the problem. There is just getting that to be high quality. This is a big problem in Colombia. Now, then beyond your basic public education system, then you have really your higher education, which is the kind of colleges and universities. You also, in many countries now, have more technical schools and technical training in, electricians and people like that. And when you get to that higher education above your basic education, that's where we've got to connect the educational system to competitiveness and to clusters. We talked a little bit about that a minute ago, but universities really need to understand how their programs and their curricula really relate to the needs of the country and the society and the economy in which they're operating. So, I mean, any university leader in this country, look, the need and the imperative of graduates in, IT-related areas. This is a national emergency, How do we agree? And so that's what university leaders ought to be doing, is they'll be looking at and understanding what are those fields where there's tremendous shortages and employment opportunities for our graduates, and how can we be world-class in those fields and supply those people that the business needs. So that's having the university not seeing itself as an isolated organization that's just out doing its own thing, but understanding how its various disciplines really connect to the clusters in the economy. And I think that schools like MIT and Stanford are very, very good at this. And they're highly connected to the private sector. They understand that some of the best science and technology is being done in the private sector. And so they build all kinds of relationships, in each field, in chemistry and computer science and bioengineering, with the clusters. And I think MIT is responsible for starting 1,000 companies or something like that in the last 5 or 10 years alone. So that the modern university needs to understand that it doesn't exist in a vacuum, and that it's fundamentally about creating more opportunities for its graduates in society. And in order to do that, it's got to be connected to the private sector as well as other institutions.
we run out of time and we need to move forward with the share value prize, but I just would love to ask you one final question, my question, and that's what's the role of share value and cluster initiatives in the post-conflict period of Colombia after the peace process is negotiated?
Well, this country has been on a really bumpy road from a conflict and trust point of view for many, many years. And as I said at the very beginning today, I think it's miraculous how much progress the society has made, the economy has made, despite those awful obstacles. And I think, obviously the surge of growth that took place after President Uribe took office and really the peace issues started to get at least addressed is one sign of that. But now hopefully, and we're going to hear a little bit later about this after the shared value session, hopefully the peace process will eventually, someday, soon I hope, actually create peace and stability. There's a lot of institutions that need to be improved as a result of that, judicial system and so forth. We have to rebuild trust in the society, and that came up earlier. And trust is important for everything. It's important for government, it's important for clusters, it's important for anything that's going to be a society that's competitive. There has to be trust and basic goodwill, among the various actors in society. I think that the shared value concept, that companies need to be looking to meet new social needs, to serve new customers, to address social problems, is a great bridge in bringing society together and starting to tackle in a consensus way involving many of us the aftermath and the suspicions and the human needs that have come out of this conflict era. And I think the cluster development, as I said earlier, is a wonderful mechanism to aggregate all the stakeholders, including the tiny little companies, to be part of a process of becoming connected and opening up opportunities and creating networks and hopefully moving to greater formality in the economy so everybody's really legitimate and open and paying taxes and really being a full citizen of this society. So I believe in this in some small way. I think this effort, these dual efforts, which I think are reinforcing of shared value and cluster development, are some of the strongest tools we're aware of to kind of bring trust and progress and initiative and action to a post-conflict society. So hopefully the day soon will come when that becomes our principal agenda.
Thank you very much, Professor Porter. Thank you very much for your energy, time, effort, and for being such a good friend of Colombia. Thanks.
My pleasure.
Shared Value Award, Chamber of Commerce of Bogotá, our juries. Elizabeth Melo, she is an independent consultant of Global Pact, presided the direction committee of the network Global Pact Colombia. She is a lawyer and emphasizes public rights of the University of Andes. Pablo Navas Sánchez Santa Maria, he is the Dean of the University of Los Andes and Instrument Engineer of the University of Cornwall and Magister in Administration of the University of Los Andes. Santiago Madriñán de la Torre, Executive Director of SECODES, the Colombian Entrepreneurial Council for the Sustainable Development. He is an economist of the University of Andes, Colombia. He performed studies in Wharton School in Alde and Bernadotte Academy. Rafael de la Cruz. He is the representative of the BID for Colombia. He has been specialist on the fiscal and municipal topics. He has a doctor in economy of the University of Paris. Jorge Ramirez Barreja, associate professor of the School of Administration of the University of Andes, professor of Harvard's Business School Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness, doctor in economy and applied economy from the University of Minnesota. No. Mr. Mariñán de la Torre received an acknowledgement from Mr. Pablo Ricardo Piedrahita, Manager of Sustainability of Café Nestlé, which leads for more than 5 years the Plan Nescafé in Colombia. Strong hands for him, please. Now we give the acknowledgement and then the picture. Ricardo Piedrahita, Manager, Sustainability Manager of Café Nestlé. Mr. Mariñán de la Torre, the second acknowledgement. One of the fundamental elements of the shared value is how from a business model generate social benefits due to the important impact in communities from the empowerment of household women. The jury has decided to give a special mention to the initiative Viste tu casa de Corona con Cerámica, dress your house with from Corona con Cerámica, in which trained promoters sell the products from Corona, contributing to the improvement of houses in sectors with high poverty levels. And the acknowledgement is received from Mr. Rafael de la Cruz, Mateo Camacho Manager of the channel Viste tu Casa from Corona con Cerámica. Give the acknowledgement and then with all the jury and the picture. Now we go with the third acknowledgement and the innovation in products and services, solving social needs or give answer to environmental topics are one of the most powerful shared values, and innovation is not only for big companies but a process that has to be given in all of the organizations. That's why the jury has granted a special mention to the company Lácteos Campo Real for its initiative Quemos Vida, which is a product with more content of calcium to assist nutrition of women and help the prevention of cancer. The acknowledgement is received from Ms. Elizabeth Melo, Luz Marina Morao Talora, General Manager of the company Lácteos Campo Real. This is the acknowledgement and of course the picture after that. Now we would like you to see a video, to watch a video in which we will have the big news of the Shared Value Award winner company. Shared Value, the Chamber of Commerce Bogotá, to promote a new entrepreneurial concept based on companies such as part of a society. The Chamber of Commerce has created the award, the Shared Value Award, an acknowledgement for a company that from a successful business had achieved to improve social, environmental, or economical situations for its innovation of creating a new product facilitating the life of Colombians and the capacity of growth and transforming effect within the company. The winner company of the Shared Value Award is Da Vivienda Bank with its initiative Davi Plata, which is a service to manage money from the cell phone without having any debit card or savings account. Through this mechanism in 2013, 45 million transactions were held, and more than 1 million Colombian people has access for the first time to a service of the financial system. DaviPlata has managed to, in the social inclusion of people that is not part of the banking system, has eased the payment of public entities and companies to their workers, and has incentivized the use of electrical money. It has been the product of innovation to achieve a model of profitable model with a social impact. We are with the companies that grow and with the companies that make more for the society. The Chamber of Commerce of Bogotá. And now the award is received from the executive president of the Chamber of Commerce of Bogotá, Monica Graves, from the Professor Michael Porter, and from Francisco Duran, the member of the Chamber of Commerce of Bogotá, Maritza Perez. She is the Vice Executive President of Personal Banking and Marketing from the Vivienda Bank, our great winner of today. Now we give the acknowledgement, the great winner of today, and the picture then.